Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Aaina podcasts. In this episode, we are talking to Vidya, who has worked at the intersections of many fields ranging from sociology to education studies to development studies. We talk about a bunch of issues, but mostly we focus on the theme of history of education. What is it? Why is it important? And very specifically, how has Vidya taught it? How has she pedagogically engaged with it? We are also joined by Vrinda from the Aaina team. So I hope all of you enjoy this conversation and do subscribe for more. So, hi Vidya, what's up?
Hi, Sayan. Hi. I'm good. How are you? Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Yeah, and hi Vrinda, what's up?
Yeah. Hi,
Hi.
Vrinda.
So, hi, looking forward to the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, so Vidya, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. What's been your journey like, and what are you doing right now?
I'm presently a faculty member at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at Jindal University. I'm primarily an interdisciplinary scholar. So, in the sense that I've had a very varied and very diverse, to put it broadly, academic background. I did my bachelor's in English sociology in Kerala. I worked as a journalist for a bit, for about 2 years. I then ventured into development studies for my master's, where I was heavily influenced by the teacher that I had there and the environment over there. So, in many ways, I was quite invested in understanding education. I was very interested really to do my research and studies in that area and in that space. And after my master's, I have done my MPhil and PhD at Jawaharlal Nehru University at the Zakir Husain Centre for Education Studies. There again, it's been a multidisciplinary environment. So I see my areas of expertise, so to say, or my broad areas of learning in sociology, development studies, and education studies broadly. And here at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, I teach courses in education policy, development, gender and development. So I have had a very interdisciplinary background. I see that as a strength really in my teaching and in my research. My research is broadly in the space of public private partnerships in education. It's been a very difficult, interesting, exasperating, uh, quite an exciting journey also for me in the learning process. So, my research is broadly looking at how private interventions work in public education systems. So,
Hmm.
that's been my sort of broad research and academic journey so far. Yeah.
I think for a lot of people who might be listening in or watching this video, I mean, there might be a question that, okay, what is it like studying in an education department? I mean, and you said that it's really contributed to your journey, particularly building a certain, interdisciplinary orientation. So a little bit about that. And Vrinda, I mean, you're also studying in an education department. So I think it would be good to just hear maybe a little bit about what does an education studies department look like? What does it do? What does it give you? And what and when you did your research in an education studies department, like does the research get directed in a particular direction because you're doing it in an education studies department? So yeah, I just had that question.
See, I myself have come from a broadly diverse background. I've not had a monodisciplinary training. So, in the sense, I've not done, say, bachelor's in sociology, then master's in sociology, then, I've ventured towards education as a space, but I'm still operating through sociology per se, the discipline. So, when you're in a broad sort of education study space, there are a multitude of things that happen in the ways in which you think about research. So one thing is, see, what is the nature of education studies in the Indian landscape itself? So when you say education in the Indian landscape, it largely refers to teacher education, B.Ed, M.Ed. So when you say the Zakir Husain Centre for Education Studies or the JNU space, it's also a very different disciplinary space in the sense that it looks at education as a site through multiple disciplines, so in the sense that education is a field rather than you're still studying it outside yourself in some ways, but you're within an education system as well, right? So the lens with which the system looks at it is multidisciplinary. But if you're coming from a background where you've done different disciplines and entered that space, it opens up your lens in a way that you can see things in a multitude of ways that other individuals perhaps take time to engage with and understand. See, the other thing is also what is the location of, say, pedagogy, learning within the Zakir Husain education space. So there, of course, there are divergences in the sense that I do see that it's something that seeks to be more theoretically engaged rather than more uh, practitioner oriented engaged. So for example, for a lot of, say, teachers or practitioners who are coming to do their higher education in the Zakir Husain Center, the center opens up certain theoretical lenses of seeing something that they've always known they've been doing, but haven't had the opportunity to step back and see it in certain lenses.
Also interesting that I think everyone feels like somewhat of an outsider in this space, because I know that because like the students who are coming from a teacher education background also, they also feel like this is not, say, exactly their department in some way. I think a lot of it is because of how education as a discipline is valued as compared to the other core disciplines that are informing the study of education here.
Yes,
So
I agree with that completely. Yes.
so there is some
Mm.
like, yeah, there's more weight given to belonging to sociology than the weight given to belonging to education. But I had a question, like, following from this, related to what you said earlier, how has the interdisciplinary training, and specifically interdisciplinarity within education studies, especially when it is more multidisciplinary in places you have been, how has that shaped your teaching, like in your own assessment?
And I think it might be good to also just make that distinction between what we mean by multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. In the education studies department, you found that, okay, there are people teaching in particular disciplines. So it's like, okay, there's an addition of different disciplines and you get different perspectives, but they are not necessarily intersecting with each other. Is that what you meant?
Yes, yes, I think that's true. So I completely agree with Vrinda in the sense that what is the nature of education itself? So if you see the hierarchy of disciplines, education is at the peripheries. Of course, there's this very interesting paper by Padma Sarangpani, soft disciplines and hard battles. So it sort of sums up really on the fact that there is a certain hierarchy to where education even is placed in the broader disciplinary landscape, even, and where it exists, and why, being within it, you still seem to want to seek validation outside it, within a higher disciplinary space rather than within the very complex nature of the education field and study space itself. Coming to what Vrinda was asking, in the sense that how has this restructured or helped me in the ways in which I teach the courses, I think it made a huge difference. So, see, when I was in the Zakir Husain Centre, I had courses to take in history and in economics as well. And I'm, of course, not trained in economics. I have a background in development studies, so I have a fair a rudimentary understanding of some economics aspects, etc. But what it really helped me was to be able to understand the disciplinary groundings itself of certain concepts. So when I went to teach at Tata Institute in the education department over there, which prominently drew from sociology of education, and then it becomes a little bit more diverse through, say, the early 2000s with the coming with the RTE 2009 and all. And it was in that in sort of more diverse education study school that I was placed in. And I had the opportunity, of course, to teach history of education.
So I think, like, Vidya, we got a sense of, let's say, broadly how, let's say, an education studies department would work. And there's a lot more to discuss about it, which we are not going into in this
Right, sure, too
podcast.
much. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think one thing that we had discussed even before we, started doing this is like that we want to talk about history of education in particular. And history of education vis-a-vis, let's say, teaching it in an education studies department, right? Also, history of education in terms of teaching it to, let's say, students coming to study education, but from many different, I guess, disciplines and with very different motivations. But I think like as a starting question, just on this broad theme, and we can have some questions on this theme, is like what got you interested in history of education? So if you could just lay out like what is history of education? I think we have done a previous episode where we talked about history teaching, right?
Right.
And I think like a lot of people would sort of intuitively understand, okay, why is it important to study history? But why is it important to study history of education? And how did you get interested in it?
So, I think my interest in history of education largely came because when I was in Zakir Husain Centre, you have to do a major discipline and two minors. At least that's how it was structured for us. And I naturally gravitated towards sociology as my major, but my minors were history and economics at the Zakir Husain Centre. See, as I was engaging with history of education per se, I think what really helped me was that a lot of the modern systems that I have engaged with, that I've gone through, like schools, choices of profession, why is it that certain academic class caste backgrounds lead to certain outcomes? So, these questions were there in my mind, yes. But if I wanted to be able to situate it within a longer narrative of how these experiences are changing and why is it that education as a site that is often thought of as a empowerment thing also leads to discrimination, thinking about history became a very important space to connect with these range of discussions. It allowed me to think about the importance of history and the conceptual differences that are very important for students also to understand, such that our thinking becomes more historically centered and not ahistorical. Often at times in conversations when we speak, we say that, but we are having this now, it also happened many years ago, it's the same thing. But it is not, right? There are particular experiences of colonialism, of independence, of nationalism that center and shape school systems in certain ways. There are subjects that we take for granted today. Maths has a certain organized body of knowledge, science has a certain organized body of knowledge, language. These subjects, or the way we see them, also have a certain history of their construction. So when I engaged with history of education, it was an eye opener really to understand how, say, in the 19th century, say, geography teaching was quite a task for a number of missionary educators and other educators when they entered, for the lack of a better word, native classrooms, to see what are you seeing the world as, what is a map, what is a region, those kind of conceptual science understandings of changes in how we are thinking about the world. Those things really made a big difference for me also, because when we think about history and education specifically, you're coming from a space where you think that colonialism has, of course, markedly changed a number of notions of education. You have these perspectives of Macaulay and the English education system. You have these perceptions that somehow there was this great learning system that existed pre the British coming to India. These very commonsensical things that inform us, if you have to be able to re-look at them from a certain perspective, you need to be able to be introduced to that perspective to look at them in certain ways. Because you are most definitely going to have students coming to your classroom who are not trained in a certain way, tell you questions like, but ma'am, learning for women was there in the Vedas. It wasn't there, like it happened only after the British came, things changed. So, how do you question these discourses? How do you question these comments, or even in many ways engage in a way not to say that learning, education, knowledge systems, diverse knowledge systems for which we have very little understanding of in certain ways or certain perspectives, it's not like they did not exist, but if you're going to engage with them, you have to have a certain perspective in being able to engage with them. You can't dismiss them outright and say that, no, this is wrong or this is right. So, even
Mm.
as a teacher, you are grappling with what is it that as a scholar to be able to converse and talk about history. It's a very
Mm.
difficult exercise because, you're not completely trained in the professional terrains of the discipline, but you have some knowledge to be able to steer the conversation in an informed way with your students. And in an education studies space, you are engaging with diverse students, not just from the academic and social backgrounds that they're coming in, but who are coming in at a time period where their lived experience is of a reality where the state has completely changed. So you have to engage with those questions that are coming in. This is not a specialized audience that is coming to learn history. This is an audience that is coming with certain lay understandings. And I don't say lay in a condescending way. I mean like very commonsensical, real understandings of the world. And you are supposed to, as a teacher, being able to shape that perspective such that they relook and re-examine that in some ways, right? So I always say history of modern education. I don't say history of education in a broad way as well, because I feel that this conceptual difference is also important. Because whenever students tell me that, ma'am, but women studied, so automatically I ask them, did women have access to all forms of education? What is the nature of education that you're talking about? Did lower caste students go to school as you understand it? So you take these systems for granted. Today when we have a lot of these messages doing the rounds that maths was there in this time, this happened at that time, you actually have to get them to question, what do you mean by maths as a subject itself today? So as a teacher, I am engaging in a multidisciplinary perspective, really, to tell students about a past such that they can make sense of the present today. I don't think that when I'm teaching my very different set of students in an education classroom, they are asking questions that can also help them make sense of the today. I cannot discount the today and give just privilege to a very specialized study of the past, which is what historians do as well. You want to
Yeah.
be able to give them some lenses to be able to make sense of the today as well.
I'm also thinking about how, so as a non-humanities student in school, and as someone who never formally studied history, but history does inform, say, a lot of study in literature or even in education, like the later disciplines I've been a part of. But it's interesting how it remains one of the few disciplines where many people have a lot of notions of concepts from it or like truths from it, but not always the conceptual ground, but also because it is as a specialized form of knowledge, like as a formal discipline, it remains inaccessible also, like intimidating, inaccessible, whatever we might want to call it. I am also curious about how you thought of connecting the experiential to the slightly more macro concepts or perspectives that you do want to teach.
Could you also tell us a little bit, like, what was the course that you were exactly teaching?
So I was teaching the history of modern education in the MA education course at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And when I was teaching that course, the reading list is pretty well grounded. It's a long taught course. I'm not the first person to teach it, of course. So you have a multitude of themes in the course. So, a number of discussions around, say, colonialism, nationalism and its impact on education, gender, access to education, caste and education, indigenous communities, tribes and education, Adivasis and education, curricular subjects. And today, of course, something that's become a big field today and has fed into a lot of the history of education discourse is the childhood studies space. That has really, really developed in a big way to see how do we understand the idea of the child as a subject in colonialism under that time. So there's a lot of literature really, and also literature, when I'm saying research literature in a broad way, there's also a lot that scholars themselves have taken on through the memoirs and autobiographies of individuals, nationalist leaders, their experiences of the school system. So there's a multitude of thematic readings around the history of education space that's quite well established. So, of course, in many ways, to be able to situate conceptual understanding, it became important to get these students to engage with texts around, say, gender or texts around caste, texts around, say, schools and subjects, is to be able to ground and get them to think, say, how do you see gender and access to schooling? Has this always been there? For example, gender is something that really, really hits ground because there's just so much of experiential and historical review and literature existing on women and their struggles to access say school systems. Even caste and education, there's just such a rich body of historical knowledge today on looking at caste and access to school systems. So when you situate discussions around that, that's one thing in which how say students engage with say the past, so to say. But then to get them to connect that those past circumstances have certain imprints on the school system today and the ways in which they engage with say those same disparities and discriminations in existing school systems today. So when students come and say, ma'am, caste is a thing of the past, I often find it important to be able to bring to their notice news items that are still showing how caste is prevalent in school systems today. So one is that discussion that comes, which is in some way the macro, micro, personal connection discussion space. But the other is at the assessment space, what is it that I was trying to get them to think about? And there I felt that family history is a very important tool and an entry point to see how much of your family and the resources and privilege that you have help you access certain ways and forms of schooling and maps your trajectories in some ways or not. And there, what really sort of influenced my assessment process were two aspects. One was the teacher fellowship program in RRCE, where they have this huge part of the fellowship is to get teachers to self reflect on how is it that they became a teacher, what has inspired or socioeconomically guided them to where they are. And this is also something that Deepa Dhanraj does in Young Historians, where it's not within the formal curricular space. So it's a very interesting exercise where Deepa Dhanraj is documenting a district school teacher with a number of government school, Karnataka school, government school students who are they're talking in Kannada as well, village students, where they're asking questions on, what is the history of their village? Why is it that their school is in a certain way? Uh, was their school or their village a part of the nationalist movement or not? And the teacher tells them, asks them, so tell me, how would you engage or investigate this question? And the students then say, think about it, rationally, logically, and say, we will ask people older than us who have perhaps lived during that time. And then the teacher then goes on to say and ask them, okay, you want to ask these people, who would you select to ask these questions to? And then the students go on to say, I know so and so, he is the panchayat person, her grandfather is still alive, maybe he is one person to talk to. So then the teacher says, okay, so will you get enough information just asking him? And then the students say, there's also a very old lady. She cleans our background. Let's also talk to her. So there's this diversity of perspectives that the students themselves are thinking of as sources to ask questions to. So that really inspired me in the way in which I thought I should design my assessment as a term paper for these students to be able to see the resources that they have in their family, to ask questions to their family, which is a difficult endeavor as well. I'm not saying that it's an easy endeavor, but to open up questions and to ask, how did they make these choices to study what they studied, be where they are? Did they have struggles in being able to access a higher education or not? So I designed a larger assessment or a term paper around that. It also happened during a period of time where I think COVID was there and a number of these students were home, right? So the home became a very active site of their presence and learning as well, and they could access their family more easily rather than when they were studying where they were staying in hostels, right? So the family became a very important resource in some ways for these students to also engage with questions of social history, being able to trace educational pathways and journeys, to be able to unpack things that they take for granted. So that became one of the main sort of thinking points for me to be able to design an assessment around those ways. it also became a learning experience for me, because I also had to reflect and think about how is it that I reached where I reached. So as a teacher, you also have to self-reflect to be able to teach this course, because it's not a, it's not like a one-way track over here, because you are also getting to unpack yourself as you help to teach them unpack themselves.
I'm also trying to think about how, basically this mode of historical thinking in education, right? So it's like, even if it's not really a course focused on either history or education, but something allied, some social science course, or like I am trying to think of this within writing courses also. Yeah, I'm trying to think of ways in which we can incorporate historical thinking in general within social sciences, especially relating to education, of course. Like this module or this way of thinking sounds very interesting to, like, in terms of engaging with social history, because that's ideally something you want as an outcome of social sciences education, right? You like
Yeah.
this as a mode of introducing reflexivity itself. So yeah, I was just thinking about that. No real question. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the end outcome really of the history of education course as well. That for these practitioners and for these like individuals who are coming to study this program in a broad way, where they leave knowing that they can apply that method to questions that they can develop on their own, outside as well, and not necessarily with respect to education, but to be able to have a thought process and a method to be able to use in other questions that they have as well, outside education even. And it just starts with very basics of investigating or thinking about who your sources are. What are your sources telling you? What are the narratives that these sources are telling you? How do you piece together a story that tells you much more and gives you a much more broader perspective of what you're looking at? I think that itself in some ways gets you to step towards a historical thinking process, definitely.
So I was interested to know, like, how did you find the students responding to the assignment? Like you talked about like where you borrowed this sort of assignment template from, and how you connected sort of conceptual understanding with, let's say, experiential reflection. But in terms of what came out, right, in terms of what students wrote or expressed, or what they even talked about in terms of their emotions about the assignment. So what happened? Like how as a teacher, how did you assess that?
So, I mean, see, it was a very overwhelming and a very like happily surprising experience. It was a mix of experiences, really. I think at some level, reading some of my students' assignments also overwhelmed me in a, like in a very emotional way as well, because they put so much of an effort in being able to write about their experiences, even to open up that part of themselves to me and write and to trust me with that and write about that really sort of really touched me and overwhelmed me in certain ways as well. But see, it required a lot of hand holding as well, because this is not an easy assignment. It took time for me to also guide them towards what is it that I was expecting as a teacher as well. Let's not take that out of the equation. So when you're giving an assessment, you also have certain expectations of the assessment as well. So it took a lot also from me to be able to guide them towards what I'm expecting, how to think about questions, how to approach individuals, how to write. And I think one of the first concerns that came up from some of the students were gaps in history, gaps in sources. What if I don't have a grandparent alive? What if my parents aren't together and I'm from a single parent family? Do my narratives still hold? Do I still have a quote unquote holistic perspective of my life? And that is also the experience of process of learning history, right? That there is no whole here, that you're piecing together from what there is. And even that absence tells you really about what the narrative is. So I had
Mhm.
students tell me that, like, I'm coming from a single parent family. How do I ask questions? Do I approach certain questions or not? So I told them, a lot of it is also really building a rapport first and foremost. It's not a really technical exercise where you just go with a interview schedule and tell them, now tell me, what do you think? It's also building a certain rapport, getting individuals to open up. And what was also interesting really is that a lot of the students spoke about the gendered nature of conversation itself. For them, they felt that a lot of the women members, the female members, who they asked questions to, were very open about sharing their experiences, because no one had asked them before,
Mhm.
really, why did you go to so and so school? Why did you make that choice? So a lot of the times they found it quite interesting where they opened this question out, and a lot of the aunts, cousins, women members that they asked these questions to were very open to share that, you know. So
Mhm.
there's also a gendered nature of being able to access, and who is also willing to talk in some ways. There are also answers that you get are close ended. No one is, some members are just saying, yes, it was good, the end. I don't want to talk more than that. Right? So there's a process also that they're engaging with. There's a method also that they're learning in the ways in which they build conversation to get narratives. Also to piece
Mhm.
together trauma, For some
Mhm.
of them, this was, of course, in Bombay. A couple of my students were Sindhi students, and their grandparents came, to Bombay after the partition. And there was a lot of also hesitation to be able to explore certain dimensions of the past which were painful and traumatic, and they didn't want to open up about. And there were
Mhm.
also questions really in being able to engage with how, some of their older senior members thought about, say, a presence of minorities in the school system, for example. There were conversations that, you could, blanket it out and say that, oh, they're being, phobic or things like that. But it actually opens out certain inner trauma also of being able to talk about things that are difficult as well. It's not easy really in the scope of the assignment to open up and talk about everything possible, but it's an exercise that allows you to engage with the process, and it's a beginning in some ways. So students who
Mhm.
really explored it and really went into the depth of using the process to learn gained a huge insight into themselves and their family, and not just the assignment only. So they did very well in their assignment, of course, because they, took it as an opportunity to really dig deep and learn. But even those who had problems and were able to articulate those problems in some ways also engaged with the troubles and difficulties of history, writing, or even like source and the speaking and the narrative of that source. These are very complex dimensions really in research, and I didn't really expect them to know the nuances or the depth of this at that stage in which I gave them the assignment. But I was really intrigued by the way in which they were able to at least think about it and express it at some level in the scope of their assignments. There were, of
Mhm.
course, students who were absolutely close minded to the scope of the assessment as well. So I
Mhm.
did have students who struggled, and I felt like the struggle came not just from wanting to do the assessment and interview members, but their own personal struggles and blocks in which they were unwilling to let go certain notions to be able to explore that dimension you know
Mhm.
so there were those students as well. So it was a
Mhm.
diversity really in many ways, but I think my larger sort of, if I were to like sort of speak about the larger experience of the assessment, it was overwhelming, it was nostalgic, it was emotional, it was all of that, of course. And there were these hints as well of individuals who, for varied reasons, as I have described, also were averse to exploring the assessment.
And that was a very detailed response. And I also really liked all of the different elements that you sort of mentioned in this response of like the intellectual shifts, the reflection, the emotions, which were sort of also at the heart of what they were doing, also the struggles and the difficulties. I think, like, one of the things that I feel like I'm thinking more about through this conversation is also how we, try to, let's say, encourage an inquiry into an educational problem or a social problem in our classrooms, right? And I feel like with history, I guess a sort of dominant idea that we have is that, oh, it's very like top down, right? In the sense ki, history is being taught as whatever, something that has been produced through scholarship and experts have produced this knowledge and here, take it, right? And already one shift that's happening is that, like, we're thinking of history as a certain kind of method or certain perspectives through which we, look at the past present connection, right? But the other thing is that, like, and it doesn't have to apply to history, right? It could be about any other discipline you're rooted in, right?
Absolutely,
I mean,
yeah.
Vrinda mentioned writing studies, and it could be whatever, a literature course, a sociology course, even a science course for that
Absolutely.
matter, right?
Yes, of course,
Yeah,
definitely.
but that whole idea of like doing, right? It's about like the student, the learner is in a process of actively doing something, right? Interacting with their lived experience, with their lived reality, through which they are sort of making those connections between sort of theory and experience. And I feel like what you mentioned, like, I mean the macro stuff as well as the assignment specific stuff, I think it really helps build an orientation like that. So I found that very useful. Um, yeah. I have one final question.
Yeah.
How did this sort of impact you as a teacher? This happened a few years back. And this seems like a very, very intense, assignment and experience in very good ways. But as a teacher, and because you have also like come through so many different spaces, right? Like we didn't get into all of that, but you have like come through different disciplines. Then you've started, worked. I mean, you've worked at three different, I guess, institutes. Uh,
Two different, yeah.
two different institutes, but I mean, I mentioned even JNU as like an
Oh, right,
institute,
sure.
but
Okay.
yeah. And you have dabbled with different disciplines, you have done your research in a particular area, right? Uh, but if we have to think of the impact of this particular experience, right, on your teaching practice or on your thinking practice, like how would you describe it?
I think that the biggest sort of impact that it has had on my teaching practice is that it gives me the confidence to be able to know that I can design a course based on these varied expertises that I have, and I can tailor it to the audience that I am teaching. That is something that I find as a very creatively challenging, frustrating, and a very interesting exercise. It helps me, it keeps me thinking constantly.
Hmm.
And for all that I can whine about the difficulties of doing it, I take the challenge as something that it really sort of pushes me to also think about creative ways in being able to think what is the student thinking. And see, when I'm saying it, it's not like precisely I know what the student is and how I can put the student in that particular space. But
Hmm.
as a teacher, you're constantly judging and evaluating. That isn't something that ever goes away. That's the nature of yourself as a professional identity as a teacher. It doesn't go away. You're constantly evaluating how much you know, how much does the student know, how do I tailor this, what do I put, what do I not put, what are the resources that I can take or not take, how do I reorient this. That process is teaching for me, and that process has actually become much better because of the experiences that I've had and the diversity of experiences that I've had. It really expands your ways, and your resources are immense. Because you've been in these different spaces, you're also in many ways exploring different ways of accessing a particular concept and presenting it to the student. So those are also like interesting ways in which it's expanded my professional scope as a teacher. It's very infuriating, frustrating, challenging, but I feel that it is in that work itself that I'm learning to be a teacher.
So this has been a wonderful conversation, Vidya, and I think we have just gone into many sort of different directions uh, in a good way. And I think that yeah, there are, I think, definitely like very uh, important sort of I don't like this word, but I was going to say takeaways, but but I think there are important insights that I think we sort of gathered and we opened up through this conversation. Uh, I hope you had a good time. And
I did, yes. I think it's been a very useful way for me also to articulate a lot of these questions and discussions we've been having.
yeah, and yeah, we hope to sort of have more conversations in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for this opportunity for me to just share my insights in the process. So thank you so much. Thank you, Shan. Thanks, Vrinda. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll see you around then. Bye.